Marriages don't always end with a single explosive fight. Sometimes they end in a very quiet moment when you see the person you love living a life you never knew existed. That's what happened to me in Chicago, though I didn't understand it yet the morning my daughter suggested we go. When my husband left for a business trip to Chicago, our daughter said, "Let's go surprise Dad." So we booked a flight. But when we arrived at that hotel and the front desk clerk looked up from her screen with a confused frown, something in my chest went cold before I even had words for why. My name is Lily Cooper. I'm 43 years old, and until that weekend I believed I understood my own life fairly well. I live in a quiet suburb outside Richmond, Virginia, in a brick colonial with a maple tree that turns the whole front yard orange every October. I work as the office manager and bookkeeper at a dental practice, a job I've held for 11 years, one that suits my particular love of order columns that balance appointments that don't overlap small problems that have clean solutions. My husband Mason is 48. He's a regional sales director for a medical device company, the kind of job that requires a good suit, a firm handshake, and enough charm to make a hospital administrator feel like the most important person in the room. We've been married 18 years. I won't pretend our marriage still burned the way it did when we were 25. Most marriages that last don't. The romance settles into something quieter, shared grocery lists, a hand on my back while we watched the evening news, the particular comfort of knowing exactly how someone takes their coffee. I had always believed that kind of steadiness was worth more than fireworks. I still believe that, actually. I just didn't understand back then that Mason and I had stopped agreeing on what steadiness meant. Over the past 6 months, his travel had increased. Client meetings, regional conferences, FaceTime with hospital procurement teams, reasonable explanations, all of them delivered in his easy, confident way. This particular trip to Chicago, he told me, mattered more than most. A major contract was riding on it. He gave me the hotel name without my asking, mentioned the conference schedule casually over dinner, the kind of detail a man volunteers when he has nothing to hide. When I suggested a video call one evening, he waved it off. The meeting room was crowded. The days were long. He'd rather just talk on the phone when he could. I didn't think twice about it. Why would I? Chloe, our 13-year-old, missed him more than she let on. She's quick and affectionate and fiercely attached to her father in that particular way only daughters seem to be, and lately the house had felt a little emptier with him gone so often. One Saturday morning over pancakes, she looked up from her plate with an expression I recognized instantly, the one she gets when she's already decided something and is just working up the courage to say it out loud. "Mama," she said, "what if we went to Chicago and surprised Dad?" I laughed at first, but she wasn't laughing, and the longer I looked at her waffle syrup on her chin, eyes bright with the idea, the more I felt something soften in me. Guilt, maybe. We hadn't done much together as a family lately, the three of us. I told myself this trip could fix, that could remind all of us what we were to each other. I requested Friday off work. I booked 2 tickets and a room at the very hotel Mason had named. Chloe spent an hour that evening making a card, her tongue between her teeth in concentration, and when she showed it to me it read, "We missed you too much to stay home." I called Mason that night to tell him Chloe and I would be busy over the weekend, a small lie meant to keep him from calling while we were in the air. He didn't ask questions. If anything, he sounded relieved in a way I didn't examine closely enough. "Good," he said. "Maybe you two should have a girls' weekend." I remember that sentence exactly because later I would replay it 100 times, turning it over like a stone, looking for the crack I should have seen. That night, Chloe couldn't sleep from excitement. She came into our room in her pajamas, hair in a loose braid, and climbed onto the edge of my bed the way she used to when she was small. "Do you think Dad will cry when he sees us?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, smoothing a piece of hair from her forehead. "But in a good way." She smiled and went back to bed, and I lay awake a long while after imagining the look on Mason's face when he opened that hotel door. Surprise, then joy, then that particular warmth he always had for our daughter. I spent the whole night picturing his happiness. I didn't know that when Mason actually saw us standing in Chicago, what would cross his face wouldn't be joy at all. It would be fear. We were up before the sun, the alarm cutting through the dark at 4:30 in the morning, the house still cold with that particular hush that only exists before dawn. Chloe was already awake when I knocked on her door, pulling on the gray hoodie Mason had given her for Christmas, the one with the little embroidered fox on the sleeve. She'd chosen it on purpose, I think some instinct telling her it would mean something to him to see her wearing it. The drive to the airport was quiet rain tapping lightly against the windshield, the highway nearly empty except for the occasional pair of headlights drifting past in the opposite direction. Chloe sat curled against the window with the card in her lap, checking every few minutes to make sure the corners hadn't bent in her backpack. "Do you think it'll get crushed?" she asked, and I told her I'd wrap it in a plastic sleeve at the gate if she wanted, which seemed to satisfy her. Security took longer than expected. We stood in a snaking line under fluorescent light, Chloe worrying aloud about whether her snow boots counted as bulky footwear. And by the time we made it through, we had just enough time to grab coffee and a waffle from a kiosk near our gate. She talked through the whole plan while we ate, how she wanted to knock on the door herself, how I should stand off to the side so Mason wouldn't see me first, how the two of us would count to 3 and yell, "Surprise," together. I watched her animated hands moving through the air as she described it, and I remember thinking clearly and simply that this had been the right decision. That whatever had felt slightly hollow in our house these past months this weekend would begin to fill it back in. I texted Mason before boarding, "Hope your presentation goes well. We love you." His reply came almost instantly. "Going into meetings. Phone may be off all day." Something about that snagged briefly in my mind. He'd told me the night before that his presentation was scheduled for yesterday afternoon, not today, but I let it go. Conference schedules shift. I've worked in enough offices to know how often the plan changes by the hour. As we taxied toward the runway, another message came through. "Don't wait up tonight. Client dinner." I remember feeling just faintly that he was clearing the day in advance, making sure I wouldn't call and find him unavailable. I told myself I was being paranoid. I put my phone on airplane mode and watched Chloe pull down the window shade so she wouldn't see how nervous she was about takeoff. Chicago greeted us with a hard, bright, cold wind coming straight off the lake and cutting through my coat like it wasn't there. Chloe pressed her face to the train window as the skyline rose up out of the flat gray horizon, all glass and steel, and for a moment I let myself feel it too, the excitement of arriving somewhere new, somewhere our family didn't usually go. We took the train into the loop, then a short walk to the hotel Mason had named an elegant business tower near the river, with a revolving door and a lobby that smelled like cedar and fresh flowers. We checked into our own room first. Chloe wanted to go straight up to her father's floor, tugging at my sleeve, practically vibrating with anticipation. But I told her we needed to confirm his room number at the front desk before we went barging down some hallway. I approached the counter and explained, smiling, that we were hoping to surprise my husband Mason Cooper here for the medical sales conference. The young woman at the desk typed for a moment, frowned slightly, and typed again. "I'm sorry," she said, "I'm not showing a guest under that name." I told her the reservation was likely under the company name instead, and she checked again more carefully this time, scrolling through what must have been a conference block list. Then she looked up at me with an expression that was trying gently to be helpful. The medical sales conference checked out yesterday afternoon. I stood there for a second without saying anything. Mason had told me the conference ran through Sunday. I remember the strange sensation of the words simply not fitting into what I already knew, like trying to force a puzzle piece into the wrong slot. I told myself there had to be an explanation, an extension, a separate event, something. Chloe was a few feet away in the seating area, still hugging her card to her chest, oblivious, watching the door for her father, the way you'd watch for a parade. I called Mason. It went straight to voicemail. I stood at that counter, turning the phone over in my hand, trying to construct some version of events that made sense when Chloe suddenly stood up and pointed through the tall windows facing the street. "Mom, isn't that Dad?" I turned. Across the street, through the gray afternoon light, a man in a familiar brown coat was walking toward the glass doors of a service apartment building, the kind of place executives rent by the month, all clean lines and discreet awnings. I would have known that walk anywhere. 18 years of watching a man cross a room teaches you the shape of him even from a distance, even through glass, even in a city that wasn't ours. But he wasn't walking in alone. A woman had her arm looped through his, laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted toward his shoulder in a way that made my stomach drop before my mind had even caught up to what I was seeing. I moved fast, stepping between Chloe and the window before she could look any longer, murmuring something about how the light was playing tricks, how it probably wasn't him. But I knew from the coat, the brown wool one I'd bought him 2 winters ago at the outlet mall in Short Pump, complaining the whole drive home about the price. I knew from the way he carried his shoulders slightly forward like he was always walking into a meeting he needed to win. I knew from the leather bag swinging at his side, the one I'd given him for his 45th birthday with his initials stitched into the strap. Chloe wanted to run across the street right then, tugging at my hand, asking why we weren't going to say hello. I told her we should get settled. First, drop our bags, let Dad finish whatever he was doing. I needed a few minutes, just a few, to understand what I'd seen before I let it anywhere near my daughter. Back in our room, I called Mason again. This time he answered with a text instead of a call, still in meetings. Can't talk. I stared at those words, knowing they'd arrived only minutes after I'd watched him disappear through a set of glass doors with a woman on his arm. There was no more room left for doubt, no gentler interpretation I could bend the facts into. I asked Chloe to stay in the room and watch something on TV while I went down to sort out a mix-up with Dad's reservation. She agreed, a little disappointed, already reaching for the remote, and I stepped out into the hallway feeling like I was walking through water. I crossed the street and sat in the corner of the apartment building's small cafe ordering a coffee. I had no intention of drinking, watching the elevator bank and the front doors. 20 minutes passed. Then the doors opened and Mason walked out with the same woman, both of them dressed for dinner, now her in a fitted black dress, him in the navy jacket I'd steamed for him myself before he left. This wasn't 2 colleagues finishing a meeting. This was something else entirely, something with rhythm and habit built into it, the kind of ease that only comes from repetition. He rested his hand at the small of her back as they walked toward the door. She turned and kissed his cheek, light and familiar, and said something I wasn't meant to hear but did anyway, her voice carrying just enough in the quiet lobby. Once the divorce is final, we won't have to keep doing this. I stood up. My legs moved before my mind had fully processed the sentence. I said his name just that flat and clear. Mason. He turned, and I watched his face do something I will never forget. The easy, practiced calm sliding off in an instant, replaced by something closer to raw panic. The woman looked between us, confused, her smile fading into uncertainty. "What are you doing in Chicago?" Mason asked, as if I were the one who owed an explanation. "Our daughter wanted to surprise her father," I said. His face went the color of the sidewalk. The woman looked at me properly now, taking in my coat, my face searching for context. "Your daughter?" she asked. "I'm Lily Cooper," I said. "Mason's wife." I watched the words land on her like something physical. Her arm slid slowly away from his. She introduced herself Claire, she said, though I barely registered it at the time, and I could see plainly that she was as blindsided as I was, just from a different direction. Over the next few minutes, in halting, disbelieving fragments, the shape of what Mason had built came into focus. Claire believed he and I had been separated for nearly a year. She believed we lived in different houses. She believed the divorce papers were filed and simply awaiting a judge's signature. Mason had even shown her a photograph of the documents. She said the pages spread across a kitchen table she'd assumed was his own. I had never seen those papers. I had certainly never signed anything. Claire's expression shifted from confusion to something colder as the truth settled over her too. She hadn't just been lied to about a marriage's status. She'd been made complicit in a fiction unknowingly for months. Mason tried to speak something about a complicated misunderstanding, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "How long have you been telling people our marriage was over?" I asked him. He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer, or if he did, he wasn't brave enough to say it out loud in that lobby in front of 2 women who had each in their own way trusted him with a version of the truth he'd invented for his own convenience. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A message from Chloe, 13 years old and still holding a homemade card, waiting patiently, 4 floors above a life she had no idea existed. "Mom, when can we surprise Dad?" I looked at Mason standing there, guilt written plainly across a face I'd known for 2 decades, and understood with sudden and terrible clarity that the hardest part of this day wasn't what I'd just witnessed. It was walking back across that street and figuring out what to say to the little girl who still believed her father was going to cry happy tears when he saw her. Before I went back to Chloe, I turned to Mason once more. I told him quietly and without drama that she hadn't seen anything, not the woman, not the apartment building, none of it, and that he was not to come to our room until I decided how or whether to tell her something had gone wrong. He tried to follow me anyway, already talking, already reaching for some explanation he thought might soften what I'd seen. I stopped him at the hotel's revolving door. "You had months to explain," I said. "You chose to lie instead." He didn't follow me further. Upstairs, Chloe was sitting cross-legged on the bed, the card resting in her lap, half watching a cartoon with the sound low. She looked up when I came in, and I watched her face change the moment she really looked at mine the way children do, reading you before you've said a single word. She asked why we weren't going to see Dad's hotel room. I told her his plans had shifted because of work, that he was staying somewhere else nearby. It wasn't a full lie. It also wasn't the truth, and I hated in that moment being the kind of mother who had to choose which one to give her. "Did Dad do something bad?" she asked, and there was no getting around the directness of that question, the way children cut straight to what adults spend hours dancing around. "Your father made choices that hurt our family," I said. "I'm still trying to understand them myself." About an hour later, there was a knock. Chloe ran for the door before I could stop her, but she slowed when she saw both our faces, mine, carefully composed. Mason's raw and uncertain in a way I'd rarely seen. She still handed him the card. He unfolded it slowly, read the words she'd written in careful looping handwriting. "We missed you too much to stay home," and I watched something in him break open. He wasn't performing. For the first time all day, I believed what I saw on his face was real, the beginning of understanding what his choices had actually cost. Chloe asked why he'd told us he was in meetings when he wasn't at the conference at all. Mason fumbled for an answer that never quite arrived. She looked at him with the plain, unblinking honesty only a 13-year-old can manage. "You told me lying was what people did when they were afraid of the truth," she said. He had nothing to say to that. Neither did I. Later that evening, after Mason left, and Chloe had finally fallen asleep with the television still murmuring, my phone lit up with a message from an unfamiliar number. It was Claire. She'd found my information somewhere, social media maybe, or an old business card Mason had left in a drawer, and she said to tell me everything. I almost didn't respond, but something told me I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with, so I let her talk. Over the next hour, in a long, unraveling series of messages, Claire laid out 9 months of a relationship built on a story Mason had constructed with real care. He'd told her we separated almost a year earlier. He said he'd been staying at the Chicago apartment on business trips, ever since, slowly building a life there ahead of an eventual permanent move once the divorce was finalized. She sent screenshots, conversations where he wrote plainly, "Lily already signed. I'm just waiting for the court date." In another, he explained he'd used money from his portion of the assets to cover the deposit on the apartment they'd been living in together part-time for months. I sat on the edge of the bathroom sink after reading that the door shut so Chloe wouldn't wake, and opened our banking app with hands that weren't quite steady. Our joint savings account looked ordinary enough. But the investment account, the one Mason had always managed, the one I'd trusted him with because numbers weren't my interest, and he seemed to enjoy them, had been steadily bleeding for 6 months. Small transfers easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. $4,800 in February, $7,200 in April, $9,500 more in June. Because he handled the investments I'd simply never checked. Altogether, nearly $78,000 had quietly disappeared. I sat there a long time with the phone glowing in my hands, doing the kind of math that has nothing to do with numbers, counting up not dollars, but months. Meetings, missed video calls, all the small excuses I had accepted without question, because I trusted the man giving them to me. When Mason finally texted asking if we could talk in the morning, I didn't answer right away. I looked instead at Chloe, asleep, with one arm flung over the blanket, still wearing the fox hoodie she'd chosen that morning, to make her father smile. I thought of the question I would eventually ask him, the one that had already begun forming in the quiet of that bathroom. Was Claire the only thing you were hiding? Somehow I already knew the answer wasn't going to be simple. Chicago hadn't just exposed an affair. It had cracked open a door, and behind it was something far larger, a life Mason had been building for months, brick by brick, while I stood in our kitchen back in Richmond believing every word he told me. We changed our flights and flew home the next morning. Mason stayed behind, telling us he needed to sort things out with work, though I understood by then he simply didn't have the nerve to sit beside us on that plane. The flight home was nothing like the flight there. Chloe didn't talk. The card sat folded at the bottom of her backpack, and she spent most of the trip looking out the window at the clouds, occasionally asking questions. I didn't fully know how to answer whether her father was going to leave us, whether this was somehow her fault for suggesting the trip in the first place. I told her as steadily as I could manage that whatever happened between her father and me, she would never be abandoned. I meant it. I still do. Once we were home, I didn't cry in front of her, and I didn't fall apart the way some part of me wanted to. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I got organized. I backed up every bank statement I could find. I photographed our tax returns, our mortgage documents, the deed to the house. I changed the passwords on my personal accounts and kept copies of our birth certificates, passports, and insurance records somewhere Mason wouldn't think to look. I didn't drain any joint accounts. I didn't destroy a single thing that belonged to him. I didn't post a word of it online. Some instinct in me understood, even in the rawest hours of that week, that how I handled this would matter, not just for the divorce, but for the woman I would still have to look at in the mirror afterward. I found a divorce attorney named Rachel Moreno through a coworker who'd gone through her own difficult separation 2 years earlier. Rachel was calm in a way that felt almost clinical, which I needed badly at the time. She told me not to confront Mason further until we'd secured our financial footing. Money moved during a marriage, she explained, generally still counted as shared property, regardless of whose name was on the account. She recommended a forensic accountant. She told me that if Mason had used our joint funds to support a relationship outside our marriage, that spending could be factored back into how our assets were eventually divided. She also cautioned me gently but firmly not to block Mason from seeing Chloe unless there was a genuine safety concern. Punishing him through our daughter would only end up costing Chloe more than it cost him. I told Rachel in a moment of raw honesty that some part of me wanted him to lose everything. She looked at me evenly and said something I've carried with me since. Your goal isn't to destroy him. Your goal is to keep him from destroying what remains. The forensic accountant confirmed what I already suspected, and then some. Nearly $78,000 had moved out of our investment account into personal accounts Mason controlled alone. Some of it covered rent on the Chicago apartment. Some went toward jewelry weekend trips, a deposit that would have secured that same apartment as a permanent residence. Worse, several of those trips had been submitted to his company as legitimate business travel and reimbursed. And tucked away in our shared cloud storage, a folder I'd forgotten even existed, one we'd used years earlier for wedding photos, was a draft separation agreement Mason had apparently been quietly assembling. In it, he proposed I keep the house but take on the full mortgage myself. He intended to keep the bulk of his retirement account. He planned to relocate to Chicago. Chloe, in his draft, would see him during select holidays, as though her presence in his life were a line item to be scheduled rather than a relationship to be protected. Mason came home 3 days later, likely expecting tears or shouting or some version of me begging him to stay. Instead, I had the financial documents laid out on the kitchen table when he walked in. He glanced at them and immediately claimed the money had been a personal bonus, something separate from our shared finances. I reminded him calmly that the funds had gone into our joint account first before he'd quietly redirected them. He accused me of violating his privacy by looking too closely. Privacy is closing the bathroom door, I told him. This was deception. He didn't have a response for that either. A few days later, Rachel formally notified Mason that I had filed for divorce and was requesting a temporary order to protect our remaining shared assets. He read the letter standing in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners over 18 years, and looked at me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and grief. "You're really going to end 18 years over one mistake?" he asked. I thought about Chicago, the hotel lobby, the apartment building. Claire's arm looped through his, the draft agreement hidden in a folder meant for wedding memories. I thought about every small excuse I had accepted without question because I trusted the man giving them to me. "Chicago wasn't one mistake," I said. "It was where I finally saw all the choices you had already made." I watched something in his face give way, not quite acceptance, not yet, but the first crack in the story he'd been telling himself. Outside the porch, light flickered on with the dusk timer, the same one Mason had installed years ago, back when installing things for our house still felt like an act of love rather than a habit left over from one. Mason moved into a rented apartment across town, one of those beige complexes with a pool no one used in winter. For the first few weeks, Chloe refused to see him. I never pushed her toward forgiveness, but I did encourage her to talk to someone, a family therapist. Rachel recommended a woman named Dr. Patel, who specialized in adolescents navigating divorce. Mason texted Chloe every day. She read the messages. She didn't answer most of them. I had my own life to keep upright in the meantime. There were bills that didn't care about heartbreak, a job that still needed me at 8 sharp every morning, a daughter whose school schedule didn't pause for any of this. Neighbors asked carefully where Mason had been lately. I kept my answers short and unremarkable. I wasn't interested in turning our street into an audience. Claire, for her part, sent everything she had to Rachel, months of text messages, apartment receipts, photographs, even the doctored image of divorce papers Mason had shown her to prove our marriage was already over. She cut off all contact with him completely. When she reached out to apologize to me directly, I didn't feel much anger left for her by that point. "You believed the same man I did," I told her. "The difference is I believed him for 18 years. Mason's company eventually noticed the pattern in his expense reports. Personal trips to Chicago quietly logged as client visits, hotel charges that didn't match any calendar entry for actual client meetings. There was no dramatic arrest, no handcuffs, nothing from a television drama. He was suspended pending an internal review required to repay the misused funds and stripped of his management title. Rather than wait for the investigation to conclude publicly, he resigned. He blamed me at first for destroying his career, as though I'd been the one filing his expense reports for him. I reminded him without raising my voice that I hadn't contacted his company at all. His own paperwork had done that on its own. The divorce settlement negotiations stretched over several difficult months. Mason initially wanted to keep the bulk of his retirement account and have me sell the house outright. But the forensic accounting told a different story than the one he wanted told. Nearly $78,000, diverted toward a life outside our marriage money, the court would ultimately treat as part of his share of our combined assets, rather than an untouched bonus. In the final agreement, I kept the house provided I could refinance the mortgage in my name alone. The retirement accounts were split according to state guidelines. Mason agreed to contribute to Chloe's therapy and future school expenses. Custody was arranged with an emphasis on stability for her, not convenience for either of us. There was no thunderous moment in a courtroom, no judge slamming a gavel, no scene worthy of daytime television. The real weight of everything settled instead in a quiet conversation Mason and I had after the mediation session ended, standing near the elevators of an unremarkable office building, both of us worn thin from months of paperwork and lawyers and careful guarded phone calls. "I never meant to lose my family," he said. "You didn't lose us in Chicago," I told him. "You spent 9 months building a life that didn't include us." He asked quietly if I thought I'd ever forgive him. I considered the question honestly before answering, because I owed him at least that much honesty even now. "Forgiveness may come later," I said. "Trust is not coming back." He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer and hated hearing it confirmed anyway. There was nothing left to say after that. We rode the elevator down together in silence, two people who had once built an entire life out of small, ordinary days, now dividing that life into folders and signatures. Outside, Chloe was waiting in the car exactly where I'd asked her to sit while the meeting finished. She rolled down the window as I approached, her expression somewhere between hopeful and braced for bad news, the way 13-year-olds often look when they're trying very hard to seem older than they are. "Is it over?" she asked. I got in beside her, started the engine, and let the heater begin to hum against the late autumn chill outside. "The marriage is ending," I said. "Our life isn't." She studied me for a moment the way she'd studied my face back in that Chicago hotel room, searching for the truth underneath my words. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her at least enough for now. She reached over and turned up the radio, and we drove home together through streets that looked exactly the same as they had a year earlier, even though nearly everything about our lives inside them had changed. 9 months passed, the way difficult years sometimes do, slowly in the moment, and then looking back all at once. The divorce was finalized in early spring. I refinanced the mortgage on my own, nervous the whole process, but I kept the house, which meant Chloe didn't have to change schools or say goodbye to the maple tree she'd been climbing since she was 6. I picked up freelance bookkeeping work in the evenings, a few small local businesses, at first a flower shop, a family-owned hardware store, word spreading slowly the way it does when people trust you with their numbers. Eventually, I turned it into something more official, a small practice of my own. It wasn't the kind of transformation you'd see in a movie, no dramatic reveal of hidden success. Just steady, reasonable independence, built one client at a time. Chloe and Mason found their way back to each other slowly through short lunches. At first, an hour here and there, nothing forced. Their relationship wasn't what it had been before Chicago, and I don't think it ever fully will be. He wasn't handed forgiveness the moment he asked for it. To his credit, he didn't expect it to work that way. He started therapy of his own, and for the first time since I'd known him, he began owning his choices out loud instead of explaining them away. I stayed out of it, mostly stepping in only when I needed to remind him that Chloe's boundaries came first, not his comfort. One evening, months into this new rhythm, Chloe sat on the porch steps beside me, while the sky turned that particular shade of orange it gets in late summer. "I still love Dad," she said, watching a pair of fireflies blink somewhere near the hedge. "I just don't trust him yet." "You're allowed to feel both," I told her, and I meant it more than I think she realized. A few weeks after that conversation, I was cleaning out a hallway closet and found the card, the one she'd made for that Chicago trip, still folded the way it had been in her backpack, the crease from the flight permanently pressed into the paper. I brought it to her and asked if she wanted to keep it somewhere. She looked at it for a long moment, turning it over once in her hands. "No," she said finally. "That was for the Dad I thought I was going to see." She didn't tear it up or throw it away in some symbolic act of anger. She placed it carefully in a small keepsake box in her room, tucked between old birthday cards and a ticket stub from a school play. It felt right somehow, not erasing what had happened, just no longer letting it steer the direction of her days. Almost a year after that first trip, Chloe and I flew back to Chicago together, just the two of us this time. We walked along the river with the wind coming off the water the same way it had before, except this time it didn't feel like something I needed to brace against. We ate deep dish pizza at a place near the loop.